Hey, amazing people. If you're subscribed, then you're a legend. Thank you so much. But most of you listening aren't subscribed, so please smash that sub button and join the family. We're almost at 30,000 subs, so let's make that happen. It's free and really means a lot to us. Thank you so much. Don't forget to hit the like button if you enjoy these stories.
I never thought something as simple as a letter could ruin my life. I'm not the type to believe in cheesy romantic stuff, but when Stacy came into my life, everything changed. It started out like any other relationship, simple and fun. She was different though, kind of quirky in a way that made me laugh, even though she was quiet and reserved. I wasn't looking for anything serious, but there was something about her that pulled me in. At first, it was the small things. She'd always find excuses to hang out, bring me little snacks I liked, stuff like that. But then it was the letters. It started out harmless enough. She'd hand me one after work or slip one into my bag if we were hanging out. The letters weren't long, just a few sentences about how her day was, something sweet about how she was thinking of me. It was cute, really cute actually. I thought it was kind of charming that it made me feel special. Maybe it was because I wasn't used to that kind of attention. Most people I dated in the past hadn't been into that kind of thing. It was just different, and I liked it. But after a while, it got a little much. It was like every single day there was a letter. One morning, I'd find one in my coat pocket when I went to work, then one in my car when I got home. The letters kept coming. They weren't even notes anymore. They were essays, sometimes 10 pages long. She'd write about everything, about how she was so excited to see me later or how she couldn't wait to tell me about her day. I remember one night, after a particularly long work day, I came home to find another letter on my pillow. I had just been feeling overwhelmed with everything else, work, family stuff, life in general, and it just kind of hit me all at once. I didn't want to be ungrateful, but I was starting to feel a little trapped. I wasn't sure if I was being a jerk, but I decided to bring it up. I told her casually that she didn't need to write me a letter every day, that I appreciated them, but it was starting to feel like a bit too much. She seemed to take it well at first, just smiled and said something like, "Okay, I understand." But after that, things were different. It wasn't immediate, but the change was noticeable. She started pulling back. We'd hang out less, and when we did, it wasn't the same. It was like she had shut down. Her eyes weren't as bright anymore. She wasn't as eager to see me or talk to me. Her responses to things I said were shorter. There was a coldness to her, something I couldn't quite place. I didn't want to overthink it, but it was obvious she wasn't the same. It went on like that for about a month. I figured maybe she just needed some space. I didn't really know what else to do. She didn't mention the letters again, and never did I, but I could feel the distance growing between us. I told myself it was probably just a phase and things would get better. They didn't. Then one night, I came home from work, and everything had changed. I opened the door to my apartment and walked inside, only to be hit with the smell of smoke. At first, I thought maybe I had left a candle burning, but as I walked further in, the smell got stronger. That's when I saw it. The letters, every single one of them, the ones she'd written to me over the past few months, were gone. I don't know why it didn't hit me right away, but the thought didn't fully sink in until I saw the blackened remains in the fireplace. They were all burned, completely, not just a few. Every single one. I stood there for a minute, frozen. The apartment felt eerily still. I couldn't quite wrap my head around it. My stomach twisted. She had burned every single letter she'd ever written to me. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't some kind of accident. It felt intentional, like a message. But what the hell was she trying to say? I don't think I understood until the next day. I tried calling her, texting her, but she didn't answer. When I showed up at her place, she wouldn't let me in. I stood out there on her porch, knocking for a good 15 minutes before she opened the door just a crack, looking at me with these empty eyes. I asked her why she burned the letters, why she was acting so cold. She didn't say anything at first. She just looked at me like she didn't recognize me. Her eyes were dead. There was no emotion. Then she finally spoke, but it wasn't what I expected. She told me that she wasn't going to write to me anymore. She said that she wouldn't do anything for me that I didn't want her to. That I'd asked her to stop writing letters, and she'd done it. She didn't explain the burning, just stared at me as though I should have already understood. Something clicked in my brain, but I couldn't figure out what it was. Her eyes seemed so distant, like she wasn't really there. She wasn't even upset. She wasn't angry, she wasn't sad, just completely empty. She told me she couldn't be around me anymore, and that was it. She shut the door, and I was left standing there in the cold, confused, and honestly a little scared. I never saw her again. I tried looking for her a few times after that, but she'd had completely disappeared. There were no signs, no messages, nothing. It was like she'd evaporated into thin air. I couldn't figure out what had happened to her or what I had done. She had been so different before, sweet, caring, even a little overbearing, but after I told her to stop with the letters, it was like I triggered something. She wasn't the same person anymore. I still can't make sense of it. I don't know if she was trying to teach me some kind of lesson or if it was all just some kind of sick game. But I learned one thing for sure: be careful what you ask for. Sometimes people don't just change, they disappear, and you're left to pick up the pieces. It's funny how you can be so sure about something, and then it completely blows up in your face. Like when you think you know a person so well, and then you realize you were just a small chapter in their story. That's exactly what happened with Zach. At first, everything was normal. We were hanging out, getting to know each other, just the usual stuff. He was a smooth talker, always charming, never boring. He had this way of making everything seem effortless, like he was just this cool, laid-back guy who had everything under control. That's what I liked about him. He was fun, and I thought I could trust him. But trust is a funny thing, isn't it? It's easy to give, but it's so hard to take back once it's gone. Zach was great at playing the perfect boyfriend. At least, that's how it looked to me. We'd hang out together, grab drinks, go on little trips, and everything seemed fine. It wasn't the kind of relationship where we were constantly texting or checking in, but we still spent enough time together that I thought it meant something. It felt like he liked me, even though we weren't super deep into anything. It was just casual, but I was okay with that. I didn't need anything more, or so I thought. But then I started noticing little things. Small things that felt off. Like how he'd always be too busy to hang out at certain times, or how he'd disappear for a few days without any real explanation. He'd say he was busy with work or dealing with personal stuff, and I'd brush it off. After all, we weren't exclusives, so it wasn't really my place to ask too many questions, right? Then one day, I found out that there were other girls. Not just one or two, but multiple. It wasn't like he was hiding it on purpose. He wasn't some pro at keeping things secret. It just sort of slipped out. I was talking to one of his friends at a party and I overheard them mention something about his other girlfriend. I laughed it off at first, thinking they were just joking. But as the conversation went on, I started putting the pieces together. It wasn't a joke. Zach had been seeing other people while he was seeing me. That's when I realized how much I had let myself get wrapped up in him. I started to feel stupid, but at the same time I couldn't let go. I didn't want to confront him though. Not yet. I wasn't ready to face the truth, even though I already knew it. Instead, I decided to keep playing the game just for a little longer. Maybe I'd get some kind of sign, some confirmation that it was worth it. But the signs didn't come. Zach wasn't the guy I thought he was. He was worse. He'd show up at my place with a smile on his face, pretending like everything was normal, like I hadn't just found out the truth about him. He'd act like the world was on his side, like we were still in the honeymoon phase. But I couldn't look at him the same way anymore. Every word he spoke felt hollow. Every time he touched me, I felt like I was just another one of his distractions. I was starting to get fed up, but I couldn't pull myself away from him. I'd gotten too deep, and the idea of being alone again was terrifying. I didn't want to face it. Then one day he was gone, just like that. No warning, no explanation. I woke up to an empty apartment. I texted him, called him. Nothing. I thought maybe he was just busy or that he'd gotten caught up in something. But days passed and still nothing. I didn't hear a word from him. It felt like I'd been completely erased from his life. I tried to distract myself. I went out with friends, kept busy with work, but there was this nagging feeling in the back of my mind. What happened? Where did he go? The unanswered questions piled up and I started to spiral. It wasn't just the fact that he had lied to me. It was that he had completely vanished without a trace. I needed to know why. It wasn't until about a week later that I found out the truth, and it hit me like a punch to the stomach. Zach had gotten married. Not to me, obviously. No, he'd gotten married to someone in New Zealand. I had no idea who she was, but I did know that I had been just another girl in a long line of girls he was playing. His life was this web of lies, and I had been just one part of it. I found out through one of his exes who was equally blindsided. Apparently, Zach had been talking to her on and off while I was still in the picture. He'd never mentioned anything about getting serious with anyone else. She told me that Zach had flown to New Zealand a few weeks ago, and just like that, he had gotten married. He'd been talking to this woman for months, planning a future with her. And the whole time, he'd been pretending like he was still fully invested in me and all the other girls he was seeing. It was honestly too much to take in. I kept wondering how I could have missed all the signs. How did I fall for this? How was I so blind to the fact that I was just one of his many distractions? It made me feel worthless. It wasn't just that he lied to me. It was that I had trusted him, and he didn't even think twice about tossing me aside. After that, I did my best to move on. I didn't want to think about him anymore. I tried to forget all the time we spent together, the way he made me feel like I mattered. But the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. He had used me and so many others without a second thought, and I let it happen. I never heard from Zach again. I don't know if he ever thought about me or the other girls he left behind. All I know is that I'm not the same person I was when I first met him. I don't trust people easily anymore. I learned the hard way that you can't always believe what someone tells you. Sometimes people are good at pretending. Sometimes people leave without a trace, and you're just left to wonder if you ever meant anything to them at all. Maybe I'll never get the closure I want. Maybe I'll never get the answers. But I know one thing for sure. I'll never let myself fall for someone like Zach again. Not ever. I should have seen it coming. Honestly, when I first met Lisa, I thought she was cool. We'd go on a few dates, hang out at bars, grab dinner at some dive spots around town. Everything felt pretty normal at first. We clicked, and it wasn't long before we were dating seriously. But then it started. Little things at first. I didn't think they were anything weird, but looking back now, I really should have caught on sooner. Lisa had this habit. Every time we ate together, she'd ask if she could have a bite of my food. It was casual at first, just the typical, hey, can I try that thing? And I didn't mind. I mean, I thought it was cute, you know. She would take a little bite of my burger or a fry from my plate, and I'd laugh it off. We'd joke about sharing food. She always had a little playful grin when she asked, and I thought, sure, whatever. I didn't think much of it. But then it became more frequent. The bites weren't just little anymore. Lisa started asking for more and more. It got to the point where I'd order something, and before I even took a bite, she was already reaching across the table to grab a chunk of my meal. And every time she'd say the same thing. Oh, I was just going to take a little bit. But it was never just a little bit. It was a whole bite, then two, and sometimes she'd start picking at the rest of my plate. At first, I'd laugh it off like it was no big deal. But after a while, I started noticing something strange. She would always try my food, and then she'd barely touch her own. We'd go out to a restaurant, and she'd order something simple like a salad or a soup, and then spend the entire time eating off my plate. She'd nibble on the edge of my sandwich or take more fries than she'd ever eaten off her own plate. And it wasn't just when we were out at restaurants. It was at home too. If we were cooking dinner together, she'd come up behind me, reach over, and grab a handful of whatever I was working on. She'd say something like, "Oh, I'm just helping you out," while showing her face with my food. After a few months of this, I started getting frustrated. The worst part was that she never once offered me a bite of hers. It was always me sharing with her. Not once did she look at my plate and say, "Hey, you want a taste of this?" It started to feel like she wasn't just sharing food, she was taking it. And I wasn't sure if it was intentional or if she just didn't care. But either way, it started getting on my nerves. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it at first. I didn't want to sound like the petty guy who got upset over food. But deep down, I was starting to get annoyed. Like, we'd go out, and I'd look at my meal, and it would already be half gone by the time I even started. It felt like she was treating my food like it was her buffet, and I was just an afterthought. I decided one night I'd had enough. We went out to one of my favorite places to grab a burger, and I knew exactly what I wanted. I'd been craving this specific burger for weeks. I ordered it with extra cheese, bacon, all the good stuff. When it came to the table, I didn't even pick it up right away. I was just looking at it, taking in how perfectly it was built. I could already feel the anticipation of that first bite. But then, like clockwork, Lisa reached for it, and I just lost it. I didn't say anything at first. I just stared at her hand on my burger. And then I did something I never thought I would do. I grabbed my plate, walked over to the trash can, and threw the whole thing away. Just like that. My perfect burger gone. All of it. I didn't care anymore. I didn't want her to have any. Not a bite. Not a single fry. Lisa's face went pale, She was staring at me, frozen in place, her hand still hanging in the air where my burger used to be. She was completely speechless, like she couldn't believe what I had just done. I didn't care. I wasn't going to let her ruin my meal again. I was done. She was appalled. You could see the shock in her face. It wasn't like she was mad. She looked more confused than anything, like she didn't understand why I had reacted that way. I just sat back down at the table, still angry but trying to calm myself down. I didn't want to make a scene, but part of me was already pissed off. I didn't know if it was because I was hungry and just didn't want to share any more, or if it was because I was tired of feeling like she was always taking more than she deserved. The rest of the night was awkward. I tried to talk to her about what had just happened, but she kept brushing it off like it wasn't a big deal. She didn't apologize. She didn't even acknowledge the fact that she had a habit of taking my food without asking. It was like I was the one who had overreacted. She went on and on about how I shouldn't have done that, but there was no apology or attempt to understand my side. It was as if she had no idea that she had been crossing boundaries this whole time. The next few days felt off. Lisa didn't reach out as much. When she did, it was short and awkward. I tried to act normal, but things were definitely strained. I wasn't sure if she was mad at me for throwing away the food, or if she was just mad that I had stood up for myself. Either way, it didn't feel like the same relationship anymore. I tried to talk about it again, but she just kept acting like it was no big deal. She never really addressed the issue, and it felt like I was the one who had to tiptoe around the situation, while she was totally unaware of how selfish she'd been. Eventually, we drifted apart. I don't know if it was because of the food or something deeper, but it didn't matter. I couldn't pretend everything was okay when it clearly wasn't. It wasn't just about the food. It was about the way she treated me like I was nothing but a source of free meals. It felt like she didn't care about me at all, just about what I could give her. I think about that night sometimes, and I wonder if I should have handled things differently. But in the end, I don't think it would have changed anything. Once you realize someone's using you, it's hard to go back. I don't regret throwing that food away. Honestly, it felt good to finally say enough. I never thought a relationship could go from sweet and casual to a total nightmare until I met Danny. At first, everything seemed great. We had this easy vibe between us, the kind where we could talk about anything and everything, and there was no pressure. We'd go to movies, grab drinks, and chat for hours. It wasn't anything serious at first, but the more we hung out, the more I felt like maybe we had something. Maybe this could be the real thing. But Danny had a way of getting into your head. He was charming, but not in the typical way. He had this quiet confidence about him, like he knew how to work the system. At first, it wasn't even noticeable, but as time went on, I realized he was the type of guy who always seemed to have a plan. Like, he was always talking about ways to make money, how to hustle, and the next big opportunity. I didn't think much of it at first. He wasn't wrong. He had a good job, he was always working on side projects, and he seemed to know what he was doing. Then came the day he pitched the idea to me. He told me about this business opportunity, something that sounded legit enough at the time. It was a chance to make a lot of money by recruiting people into this program. The more people you signed up, the more money you made. It sounded like a pyramid scheme, but I didn't have the vocabulary to recognize it back then. Danny made it sound like it was the smartest thing I could do with my time. He told me it was all about connecting with the right people, selling products, and building a team. He was already making good money from it and promised I could be just as successful if I joined in. He made it sound like it was just the beginning of something big. I thought about it for a while, but I trusted Danny. I figured if he was doing it, maybe it was worth a shot. So I gave in. I took out a small loan to invest in the program and get started. Danny walked me through the process, introduced me to his team, and helped me set up my own recruitment pitch. It all seemed harmless at first. I started getting a few people to sign up, and I thought, hey, maybe this is actually working. But as the weeks went on, it felt like everything was slowly slipping out of my control. The money I was putting in wasn't coming back. The more I invested, the less I got. I kept thinking that eventually it would turn around, but it didn't. I was chasing after recruits, trying to convince people to join, but it started to feel more like a trap. Danny was always there, reassuring me, telling me that it would take time, but it would pay off. He'd throw out words like patience and consistency, but all I could see was my bank account draining faster than it ever had before. I didn't want to admit it, but I started to feel like I'd been played. I started looking into it more, and that's when it hit me. This was a full-blown pyramid scheme. The products they were selling were overpriced junk, and the entire thing was built on recruiting new people who'd pay in. The ones who made money were the ones at the top. Everyone else was stuck, losing money and getting nowhere. I tried talking to Danny about it. I was upset, confused, and angry at myself for getting involved. I wanted out, but Danny kept telling me to stay patient. He said this was how business worked, that you had to trust the process. But the longer I stayed in, the worse it got. I was sinking deeper into debt, and the people I recruited were getting frustrated too. Everyone I tried to help ended up worse off, and none of us were making the kind of money Danny had promised. I didn't know how to get out. The more I tried to distance myself, the more pressure I felt from Danny to keep going, to recruit more people, to not give up. He reminded me about all the success stories, about how the top earners had started just like me, working their way up. But I could feel the walls closing in. I didn't want to lose any more money, and I definitely didn't want to lose the friends I had dragged into this mess. One day, I decided to take action. I told Danny I was pulling out, that I was done. I couldn't keep doing this. I told him I was done losing money. I was done trying to recruit people into a scam. Danny didn't react the way I expected. He wasn't mad, at least not in the way I thought he would be. Instead, he acted like it was no big deal, like he didn't care that I was walking away. Then the worst part came. Danny straight up told me that it was my fault for getting involved in the first place. He didn't offer any sympathy, didn't try to help me figure out how to get my money back. He just shrugged it off and said, "You should have known better." He made me feel like I was stupid for trusting him, like it was all my fault. He didn't offer to pay any of the money back, didn't try to make up for any of the losses I'd suffered. In fact, he acted like it was some kind of lesson I needed to learn on my own. It felt like a slap in the face. I didn't know what to say. I was standing there, feeling like an idiot, completely betrayed by someone I thought I could trust. And the worst part was, Danny didn't even seem to care. It was like he had used me, taken advantage of my trust, and then discarded me when I was no longer useful. That was the last time I saw him. I tried reaching out once or twice after that, but he ignored me. I never got the money back, never heard from him again. Danny disappeared as if he never existed. I've never felt more stupid in my life. The money I lost wasn't even the worst part. It was the fact that I let someone manipulate me like that. I let him talk me into something I knew deep down was wrong, and I let him convince me to keep going even when everything was falling apart. Looking back, I can't believe I let myself get wrapped up in it. Danny was just using me, and I was too blinded by the idea of success to see it. I learned the hard way that sometimes the people you trust the most are the ones who end up doing the most damage. I don't think I'll ever forget how it felt to have someone I cared about turn their back on me when things went wrong. I still can't figure out how I ended up in that mess. I mean, you date someone, you have fun, and then things either work out or they don't, right? But she was different. From the first time we met, there was something a little off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. She was fun, spontaneous, and had this weird energy about her that made you feel like you were the only person in the world. It was intoxicating at first, but then things took a weird turn after date 5. That's when she did. At first, things with Anna seemed normal. We went on dates, had a good time, and I was pretty into her. She was this wild, free spirit who lived in the moment. I remember we went to a bar on our 4th date, and she had this mischievous grin the whole time, like she was always up to something. But I didn't think much of it. I thought maybe it was just part of her personality. By the time we were 5 dates in, I was starting to feel like I didn't even know what I was getting myself into. It wasn't that I didn't like her. She was cool, fun to be around, and honestly, she made me laugh. But there were little things that started to stick out. Like she would get way too intense about us being a thing, even though we hadn't really had that conversation. She'd drop hints about us being together forever, even though we were just getting started. It was on our 5th date that she mentioned she wanted to get a tattoo. Not just any tattoo. She wanted to get my name tattooed on her. My name. I thought she was joking at first. I laughed, told her to chill, but she didn't. She was dead serious. She told me she felt like it was fate, like she was meant to be with me. I thought she was just caught up in the moment, but the more she talked, the more I realized she wasn't messing around. She had this look in her eyes that told me she wasn't joking. I told her she didn't have to do something that drastic. I was flattered, but we weren't even that deep into the relationship. I mean, 5 dates. That's not even enough to figure out if you're going to last. But Anna didn't care. She was already talking about how she was going to go to the tattoo parlor the next day. She said she had to do it. There was this urgency in her voice, like if she didn't do it, she'd miss her chance at something important. I tried to talk her out of it, but she wasn't listening. It felt like nothing I said would make a difference. So I just told her that if she really wanted to go through with it, that was on her. I wasn't going to stop her, but I wasn't exactly thrilled by the idea either. The next day, she showed up to our date wearing this weird, proud smile. She was wearing a dress, and I could see a small bandage on her thigh. I didn't really think much of it until she told me to check it out. When she pulled down her dress, I saw it. Her left ass cheek, right there on display, had my name permanently inked on it. Danny was written in bold script, clear as day. I froze. My first thought was, what the hell? I didn't know how to react. Was she serious? She just went out and did this without even talking to me about it. I felt a little sick to my stomach. Part of me wanted to laugh, thinking it was some kind of joke, but it wasn't. This was real. She had literally tattooed my name on her. I didn't even know what to say. I tried to smile awkwardly, not wanting to hurt her feelings, but I couldn't wrap my head around it. This was a level of commitment I wasn't ready for, especially after only 5 dates. I mean, how do you even react to something like that? Over the next few days, I started to feel more and more uncomfortable with the situation. I couldn't shake the thought of her walking around with my name on her like it was some kind of permanent stamp. It felt too much too soon. And honestly, I didn't feel the same way about her. I liked her shirt, I wasn't ready to be tied down in that way. Her impulsiveness had gone too far, and now I felt trapped by it. By date 10, I knew I had to break up with her. It wasn't just a tattoo. It was the intensity, the way she seemed to think we were this forever thing when we hadn't even figured out what we were yet. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when I was starting to feel suffocated. I tried to be honest with her about how I was feeling, but she didn't take it well. She looked crushed when I said it wasn't working. She didn't understand. To her, this was supposed to be something permanent, something meaningful, but to me it was just too much. The worst part was what came after we broke up. And I couldn't just let it go. It wasn't enough that we ended things. She had this thing out wanting to make everything right. So she went to the tattoo shop and got it removed. She didn't tell me at first, but I saw her post something on social media a few weeks later. It was a picture of her in the tattoo parlor with a sad caption about getting her mistake removed. My name was gone, but the whole situation still felt so off. She had to go through that pain just to undo something she never should have done in the first place. It didn't make me feel any better. I didn't want her to go through that. What was meant to be a fun, lighthearted thing turned into something heavy and regretful. I kept thinking, how could she be so sure about us after only 5 dates? But more than that, I was just freaked out by how fast she went from being this cool, laid-back person to someone who tattooed my name on her without even a second thought. After all that, I couldn't help but wonder what she saw in me and why she felt like we were already meant to be. I didn't think that way at all. I'm still not sure if she was just trying to make something work that wasn't meant to be, or if she genuinely thought we had something special. Either way, I'll never forget the feeling of seeing my name on her like that. A tattoo wasn't supposed to be the thing that made or broke a relationship, but somehow for Anna it was. I don't know why I didn't see it sooner. Maybe I was just too caught up in the idea of it all, or maybe I wanted to believe the best in him. But Tom, he really messed with my head. Looking back, I still can't understand how everything unfolded the way it did. We'd been dating for a couple of months when I moved in with him. I know it's way too soon. People tell you not to do that, but at the time, everything felt right. It wasn't like we were rushing into anything. We just clicked. Or so I thought. The early days were perfect. We'd spend hours talking, cooking together, watching movies, all that cheesy stuff couples do. But then, little by little, things started to shift. It's funny how a few words here and there can completely change the vibe, right? I'd always loved to cook. I've been in the kitchen for as long as I can remember, helping my mom and sister prepare meals. It's something that makes me feel at home. So, naturally, when I moved in with Tom, I started cooking for him. I figured it would be a nice way to show I cared, you know. I'd make dinner after work, and we'd eat together. I was really putting my heart into it, trying new recipes, experimenting with flavors. But Tom, he wasn't impressed, and I'm not talking about the kind of "it's fine" response you get when you cook something that's just okay. No, he was downright critical. Every time I made something, he'd pick at it, comment on how it wasn't quite right or how it could have been better. It started to sting, but I thought maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe I wasn't as good at cooking as I thought. And then it happened. One day, after I made this huge homemade lasagna, he told me it was okay, but that my sister's lasagna was so much better. That my sister could cook, like really cook. I laughed it off at first, but the more he said it, the more it felt like he was just being rude. I mean, who says that? Who says something like that to someone who was trying to do something nice for them? At first, I tried to brush it off, but then he did it again and again. Every time I made something, it was always compared to my sister's cooking. Every single time. It wasn't just that my food wasn't good enough. It was that my sister's food was apparently perfect. It was like he could never see the effort I was putting in, no matter how hard I tried. It was almost like he didn't care about me or my cooking at all. He was so obsessed with the idea of my sister being this perfect cook, and no matter how much I tried, I couldn't live up to her. One day I snapped. I made this killer chicken stir fry that I was pretty proud of. It had all the right seasoning, the perfect balance of flavors. I was excited to serve it to him. But as usual, he took a bite, chewed, and then made that face, the one that made me feel like I was wasting my time. He told me it wasn't bad, but my sister's stir fry was so much better. I had enough. In that moment, I felt completely defeated. It was like nothing I did was ever good enough, so I decided to test him. I made the same stir fry the next day, but this time I told him that it was my sister who made it. I didn't tell him I cooked it. I wanted to see what he'd say if he thought it was her. And sure enough, the second he tasted it, his eyes lit up. He went on and on about how amazing it was, how it tasted just like my sister's. He said it was perfect. He was genuinely excited, even praised my sister's secret recipe, and how it just blew him away. I almost couldn't believe it. It was exactly the same food I'd cooked the day before, the same meal he rejected. I watched him, feeling the anger simmer inside me as he devoured it like it was the best thing he'd ever tasted. And then the moment I was waiting for came. After he finished eating, I told him the truth. That wasn't my sister's stir fry, it was mine. The one you said it was awful yesterday. His face immediately dropped. For a second, he looked like a deer caught in the headlights. I don't even know why, but seeing him react that way, it felt good. I wanted him to feel guilty. I wanted him to know that I wasn't stupid. He'd been manipulating me, and I was done letting him make me feel less than. But his reaction, it wasn't what I expected. He just sat there blinking before shrugging and muttering something about how he didn't mean it like that. He didn't think it was that bad, but it wasn't as good as my sister's. He tried to backpedal, making it sound like nothing had changed. He was so casual about it, like he thought it was no big deal that he had spent all this time belittling me and my cooking. That was the moment I realized how messed up things had gotten. He didn't even apologize. He didn't care. It wasn't about the food anymore. It was about how he could manipulate me into feeling inferior, how he could control my emotions without me even realizing it. Every comment, every comparison had been a subtle way for him to assert control over me. It wasn't about the meals at all. It was about his ego. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the plate of food in his face, but I didn't. I just stood there staring at him, feeling like everything had been a lie. The whole relationship, everything he said about caring about me seemed fake. I had been trying to please him, trying to show him that I could do something right, but all he wanted to do was tear me down. That night I left. I packed my things and told him it was over. I didn't even care how he reacted. I couldn't be with someone who made me feel like I wasn't good enough, who played these mind games with me. I never went back, and I didn't feel any guilt. Maybe I should try to talk it out, but I knew deep down that if I stayed, I'd just be trapped in this cycle of him making me feel less than I was. I realized that his criticisms of my cooking weren't about the food at all. They were about making me feel small. Tom was a master manipulator, and I had fallen for it. I don't know what I was thinking, honestly. I thought everything was going smoothly. Hester and I had been dating for a few months, and I had this feeling that she was the one. We'd done the typical stuff. Dinners, movies, even weekends away. She was beautiful, confident, and had this way of making everything feel like an adventure. She was always up for anything, and that's one of the things I loved about her. But looking back, I should have picked up on the low red flags. It's funny how everything makes sense in hindsight, right? Everything started to unravel that night at the party. We had been invited by one of my old buddies, Mark, to a get-together at his place. It was a casual thing. Nothing too fancy, just drinks, music, and a bunch of people I hadn't seen in a while. I didn't think much of it. Hester had been excited, saying it would be fun to meet my friends, and I was looking forward to it too. At first, things were great. Esther fit right in. She was chatting with everyone, making them laugh, and even getting along with people I hadn't expected her to click with. She was outgoing and had this charm that seemed to captivate everyone she met. But there was this one moment about an hour into the party that would change everything. I was standing near the kitchen, talking with Mark and a couple of my other friends when one of them, Ben, pulled me aside. Ben had this weird look on his face like he'd seen a ghost or something. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, staring at Hester from across the room. I didn't think much of it. I figured he was just a little buzzed or something. Then he spoke, and I swear my stomach dropped. He told me he recognized Hester. I was like, okay, she's probably met him before at some other event, no big deal. But Ben didn't seem like he was going to let it go. He looked at me with this strange expression, almost a mix of confusion and something darker that I couldn't quite place. He kept staring at her, and it made me feel uncomfortable. At first, I laughed it off, thinking it was some kind of joke. But then Ben dropped the bombshell. He told me that he knew Hester because she used to be a stripper. He said she had danced for him at a club a while back. He couldn't remember exactly when, but he was sure it was her. I was stunned. I didn't know what to say. At that point, I wasn't sure if I should confront her right there or just walk away. But I had to process it. Was he messing with me? I knew she had a past, but the thought of her doing something like that, it felt like a punch in the gut. I wasn't one of those guys who was super judgmental about people's pasts. We all have one, right? But for some reason, hearing it from someone else like it was just a fact he was throwing at me made everything feel so strange. I had to know the truth. I excused myself from Ben, who was still watching Hester, and made my way to the living room where she was talking to some people. My heart was racing, and I felt this weird mix of embarrassment and disbelief. I wasn't sure how I was supposed to feel: angry, confused, or just betrayed. I walked up to her, trying to act normal, but I couldn't stop the flood of questions in my head. Did she know Ben was here? Did she even remember him? Why had she never told me about her past? I never asked her about it before. I didn't feel like it mattered, but now it felt like a secret hanging in the air. She looked up when I approached, smiling at me like everything was fine, but I couldn't ignore the tension that seemed to be building up between us. I took a deep breath and asked her about it, trying to keep my voice calm. Hey, Ben says he recognizes you. He says you used to work at a strip club. Her smile faltered for a split second. For a moment, I thought she might deny it. Maybe play it off like it was nothing. But instead, she just sighed. It was like everything went still for a second. She didn't look surprised that I knew. It was almost like she expected me to find out. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said it. Yeah, I did it. A while back. I don't anymore, but it's a part of who I am. I didn't know how to respond. I think I muttered something like, "Why didn't you tell me?" But she didn't seem fazed by it. She just shrugged, as if it was no big deal. People have their pasts, she said, her voice cool. It doesn't change who I am now. But that wasn't the problem, was it? It wasn't about her past. It was about the fact that I had no idea. And that hurt more than I thought it would. It wasn't about being a stripper. It was about the trust, the honesty. If she was willing to hide something like that, what else was she hiding? I didn't know how to feel. Part of me wanted to just let it go, but another part of me felt like I was being lied to. My mind started racing. Had she danced for any of my other friends? Was Ben just the tip of the iceberg? For the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that everyone else knew something I didn't. It felt like I was the only one who didn't have the full picture. It's a weird thing realizing that the person you're dating has a side to them you know nothing about. It makes you wonder what else they've been hiding. By the end of the night, I had to leave early. I couldn't stay there anymore, pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. Hester could tell something was off, but she didn't push it. I guess she already knew I was processing things in my own way. We didn't talk much after that night. I don't think I'll ever forget that moment when she told me the truth. It wasn't about what she did in the past. It was the fact that she didn't trust me enough to tell me sooner. And that's what made me question everything. I'm still not sure what to make of it all. I don't know if I can move past that. Maybe it's petty, but sometimes it's the things people hide, that make you realize just how much you don't know. I can still see it so clearly in my mind, the way everything came crashing down in that instant. I never thought something like that could happen to me. I had heard stories about people who get cheated on or duped by their partners, but I always thought those were just bad luck situations. Not me. I wasn't some naïve girl who would fall for that kind of thing. But I did. And the worst part, it happened in the most unexpected way. It all started like any other Saturday night. Stefan and I had been dating for a while, and things were pretty serious. We were always together at dinners, walks in the park, movie nights. It felt right. I'd even met some of his friends and coworkers. He seemed like he was really into me, and I was into him. It was one of those relationships where everything just clicked. We talked about taking trips together and even discussed future plans, so I didn't have any reason to doubt him. That evening, he suggested we go out for dinner. I was excited. It had been a long week, and a nice meal out sounded perfect. He didn't give me a location right away, just told me he'd pick me up and we'd head to a surprise spot. I love surprises, so I was all for it. When he picked me up, I noticed he was acting a little weird. He seemed a bit off, distant even. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe he had a tough day at work or something. I let slide, trying to keep the mood light. We drove for what felt like forever. We passed a few restaurants I recognized, but he didn't seem interested in stopping at any of them. He kept on driving farther and farther into town. By this point, I was starting to get a little curious. I had no idea where we were going. I asked him a few times, but he kept saying, "You'll see when we get there." Eventually, we pulled up to this little cozy Italian restaurant I had never been to before. I didn't think much of it. It looked nice, quiet, and romantic, just the kind of place I'd expect him to choose. He opened my door and led me inside. There were a few people dining, but it wasn't crowded. I felt relaxed, like it was going to be one of those nights to remember. The host greeted us, but before we could get seated, Stefan stopped. I watched as his face turned pale, his smile suddenly fading into something less certain. He paused for a moment, looking like he'd seen a ghost. I thought maybe he recognized someone, but it didn't seem like that was the case. He just stood there, almost frozen. I was about to ask him what was going on when I looked over and saw them. At a table near the window, there they were, Stefan's wife and 3 kids. It took me a moment to process it. I almost didn't believe what I was seeing. I mean, his wife, kids? How was this possible? My heart started racing and my stomach felt like it was turning upside down. I couldn't breathe and it felt like the ground beneath me was disappearing. I stood there staring at them, unable to move. I don't know how long it took for me to realize what was going on. Stefan had been leading this double life, and I had no idea. His wife and kids were sitting there, eating, completely oblivious to me standing a few feet away. I looked back at Stefan. He had this look on his face, this mix of panic and guilt. It was clear he was trying to figure out what to do. But in that moment, nothing he could say would make a difference. I didn't care about the excuses or the explanations. The truth was staring me in the face, and it hit harder than anything I could have imagined. I didn't want to cause a scene. I didn't want to confront him there and in front of everyone. But I couldn't just stand there either. I was in shock. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. How had I not known? How had I been so blind? I felt my eyes tear up, but I wasn't about to cry in front of him. I turned to walk out, not caring what he did or said. I just needed to leave. I needed space to process what had just happened, breathing in. I could hear Stefan calling after me, but I didn't stop. I made my way out of the restaurant, my legs barely able to keep me steady. I stumbled to the car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the door handle. I finally got inside and locked the doors, just sitting there for a few minutes, trying to collect myself. But all I could see in my mind was the image of his wife and kids, sitting there like they were the most normal thing in the world. Eventually, Stefan came out and knocked on the window. I didn't roll it down. I didn't even look at him. The anger bubbling inside me was too much. My mind was spinning with questions. Why hadn't he told me? Why had he lied? How could I have been so stupid? He knocked again, and I felt the urge to drive off to get away from him as far as I could. But something inside me needed to hear it from him. I cracked the window just enough for him to speak. He tried to apologize. He said he never meant for it to happen like this, that he had been trying to end things with his wife for a while, but it hadn't worked out. He said he loved me and that he was planning on telling me everything, but he hadn't figured out how. He kept saying he was sorry over and over, but I wasn't listening anymore. The damage had been done. I remember thinking, how could I have been so blind? How could I have let someone get this close to me when they were living a complete lie? I had thought we were building something real, but it was all built on lies and deceit. I felt sick to my stomach. After a while, he stopped talking. I could tell he was just waiting for me to say something, but there was nothing left to say. I told him to leave me alone and drove off without looking back. It's been a few months since that night, and I'm still trying to process what happened. I haven't talked to him since. I don't want to. He broke my trust, and I don't think I could ever get that back. I still think about how casually he just let me walk into that situation, not even considering how it might affect me. I learned something that night. People can hide a lot behind a smile, and you never really know someone until you do. I don't even know where to begin with this. Looking back, I still can't believe it all happened so quickly. I thought things were going well with Stella, really well, and in fact, we'd only been dating for a couple of weeks, but it felt like we had some kind of connection. It wasn't like we were deeply in love or anything, but I liked her. She was funny, smart, and honestly, I thought we had a good thing going. Little did I know, it was all out to fall apart in the worst way possible. One evening, I was over at her place hanging out, watching some dumb reality show on Netflix. She seemed a little off, but I didn't think much of it at first. We'd only been together for a short time, so I didn't expect her to tell me all of her problems right away. But then, out of nowhere, she started talking about her kidney disease. At first, it didn't click. I knew she'd been having some health issues, but she never mentioned kidney problems. She explained that her kidneys weren't functioning properly and she needed a transplant. Then she said the part that threw me for a loop. She asked me for my kidney, just like that. My stomach dropped. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I had only known this girl for a couple of weeks, and now she was asking me for something so big, something so personal, something I wasn't sure I could even give. I didn't know how to react. I told her that I wasn't ready for something like that we didn't even know each other well enough for me to consider such a huge decision. But she didn't take it well. Not at all. She got quiet, her face went pale, and I could tell something had shifted. It wasn't like she was angry, at least not at first, but she definitely wasn't happy. Over the next few days, things between us started to feel different. She would text me, but there was an edge to her words that hadn't been there before. She started talking about her journey, about how much pain she was in, and how she just needed someone to help her. And then, out of nowhere, I started seeing her posts on Facebook. It wasn't just a post or two, it was a full-blown campaign. She shared a story about how her kidneys were failing, how she needed a transplant, and how someone in her life, me, had the chance to save her but refused. She didn't just tell her friends, either. She blasted it everywhere, tagging me in the posts, sharing my name, making it clear that I was a guy who turned her down when she was in desperate need of help. At first, I thought maybe it was some kind of misunderstanding, but the more I looked at the posts, the worse it got. Her followers started commenting, some of them supportive, others judgmental, all of them piling onto me. People I didn't even know were telling me I was a horrible person, questioning how I could let someone in need suffer. She made me sound like I was the villain and I had no way of defending myself. I tried reaching out to her to explain that I didn't mean to hurt her, that I didn't know what she was going through and just wasn't ready for that kind of commitment. But she ignored me. She didn't want to hear it. Every time I checked her page, there was another post, another rant about how cruel I was, how I turned my back on someone who needed help. It was like the posts just kept coming. It was starting to feel like a public trial, with everyone watching me and judging me. It was embarrassing. It was humiliating. People at work started talking about it. My friends started asking me what was going on, and I didn't even know what to say. It wasn't like I was heartless. I didn't want her to be sick or in pain. But I wasn't ready to give up something so huge, especially when we barely knew each other. I didn't know her that kind of sacrifice, especially not after just a couple of weeks of dating. And then it got worse. She started messaging me more and more often, telling me how much I had hurt her, how selfish I was, how I would never understand the pain she was going through. I could tell that she was spiraling, that she wasn't in a good place mentally. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to be cruel, but I also didn't want to be forced into something I wasn't comfortable with. One night, after I'd had enough of the online attacks, I decided to confront her face to face. I went to her place to talk, hoping we could have a calm conversation and clear everything up. But when I got there, it was like I didn't even know her anymore. She was angry, her face red, eyes full of tears, and she kept repeating that I had broken her heart. That I was the one who had failed her. She started talking about how she'd been stuck in this cycle, how she needed help, and how I was the only person who could save her. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't just give up my kidney for someone I barely knew. I wasn't heartless. I just wasn't ready to make that kind of decision. After that night, I cut things off. I couldn't take the pressure, the constant public shaming. I told her I couldn't be involved in her life like that. But she didn't take it well. She kept posting, kept dragging me through the mud. I lost friends over it. People I'd known for years started picking sides, and I was the one who looked like the bad guy. I tried to defend myself, but it didn't matter. Once something is out on social media, it's out of your control. I didn't hear from her for a while after that. At least not directly. But every time I logged into Facebook or saw someone who knew her, I would see her posts about me. She painted herself as the victim, as someone who had been hurt by a guy who didn't care. She didn't care that I had feelings too. She didn't care that I wasn't ready for that kind of commitment. It's been months since that all went down, and I still feel the aftermath. People still ask me about it, and I still get messages from people who believe what she said. It's like this cloud hanging over my head. And every time I think I've moved on, I see another post or hear someone else's opinion, and it all comes rushing back. I don't know what happened to Stella. I don't know if she got the transplant she needed or if she's still out there trying to get sympathy from people. But I do know one thing. I never want to go through anything like that again. Some things just aren't worth the drama, no matter how much someone wants to guilt you into them. I can't even believe I'm writing this. When I think about it, I still get a bit weirded out, but I guess that's how this stuff goes when you find out that someone you were dating has a whole different side to them, right? I met Joey through a mutual friend at a party, and I thought he was pretty cool at first. He was charming, funny, had a good job. Everything seemed normal. But then, after a few weeks of dating, I realized that normal wasn't exactly what it seemed. The first time I walked into his apartment, I didn't think much of it when I saw a couple of tanks in the corner of the room. It's not that unusual for someone to have a few reptiles or something. But as I spent more time there, it became obvious Joey had a lot of pets, like way more than you'd think. There were lizards, snakes, turtles, even a couple of tarantulas. It was like walking into a mini zoo, and not the kind you visit on a weekend with your family. More like the kind that gives you a weird vibe because you don't know what's lurking behind the glass. At first, I thought it was kind of cool. I mean, I'm not terrified of reptiles or spiders or anything, but I wasn't exactly obsessed with them either. It was just his thing. I let it slide. He'd often talk about how each pet had its own personality, how they were like his little friends. But it started getting weird when he started letting them roam freely around his apartment. I'd walk into his kitchen, and there would be a gecko chilling on the countertop, or I'd turn around in the bathroom and see a tarantula slowly creeping up the wall. It was like walking around a science lab, but not the cool kind, more like the creepy mad scientist kind. The worst part, Joey didn't even act like it was a big deal. He just casually moved the tarantula off the couch like it was some household pet, which for him it was. But things took a turn when I accidentally stepped on one of his spiders. I was leaving his apartment after one of our dates. It had been a long day, and I wasn't paying attention to where I was stepping when I left the living room. Next thing I know, I felt something crunch under my foot. When I looked down, I saw a tarantula crushed. I immediately freaked out. I mean, who wouldn't, right? I'd stepped on one of his pets, one of the many creepy things that was roaming around his place. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't sure how to handle this. It was just an accident, but in that moment, I was already regretting stepping into his world of reptiles and arachnids. Joey saw the whole thing. His face changed instantly. He wasn't just upset, he was furious. He started shouting, something about how I didn't respect his pets, how they were important to him. I tried to explain it was an accident, that I didn't mean to kill his spider, but that just made him worse. He stormed off to another room and started pacing. I could feel the anger in the air. It was like something snapped inside him. I didn't know what to do, so I just stood there, watching him. And then he said something that completely threw me off. He told me that I needed to make it right. At first, I thought he meant he wanted an apology, maybe to get a new spider or something, but that wasn't it. He wanted me to hold a funeral for the spider. He actually wanted me to get the body, put it in a little box, and bury it properly, like I was some kind of mad scientist's assistant. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I just stood there, dumbfounded, trying to wrap my mind around the fact that this guy, who I thought was normal, was now demanding that I throw a funeral for a tarantula. But he wasn't kidding. He didn't back down, not for a second. He wouldn't let go. And honestly, I didn't know what else to do. I didn't want to lose him over something like this, especially since we had been seeing each other for a little while and things were going pretty well otherwise. So I did it. I put the spider's little body in a box on the shovel, and we went outside to properly bury it in his backyard. The whole time, Joey was making this weird speech about how the spider would live on in the ecosystem or something. I'm not kidding. It was like some kind of bizarre ritual I never thought I'd be part of. I kept trying to remind myself that this wasn't normal. But there I was, standing in his backyard, holding a tiny wooden box with a dead spider in it, listening to him talk about how much it meant to him. I don't even know what came over me. I didn't want to make waves, didn't want to seem like the crazy one, so I just went along with it. The whole situation was so strange that I felt like I was in some kind of dream. After the funeral, things didn't really go back to normal. Joey was still upset, but I could tell there was something deeper going on. He started keeping an even closer eye on his pets. I would come over, and he'd insist I take off my shoes before I even walked into his apartment. If I moved too quickly, he'd immediately tell me to calm down so I wouldn't startle his lizards or the other animals. He got more obsessive, and it was clear that his pets were now the most important thing in his life. It made me feel like I was walking on eggshells every time I visited. I never knew where the animals were or when one would suddenly appear from nowhere. Sometimes I'd be watching TV, and out of the corner of my eye, I'd see a snake slither across the floor, or a lizard pop out from under the couch. It became a game of avoiding his pets and trying not to disturb the fragile balance of his animal kingdom. Eventually, the whole thing became too much. I couldn't deal with the constant tension, the weird rituals, and the fact that I couldn't even walk around his apartment without worrying about stepping on something. Joey was a nice guy, but this was a deal breaker for me. It was just too weird. So I ended things with him. I don't think I'll ever forget the day I left. He seemed upset, but didn't beg me to stay. Instead, he just watched me walk out, his eyes filled with that same weird intensity I had seen before. The last thing he said to me was that if I couldn't respect his pets, that I didn't deserve to be in his life. I don't know what happened to Joey after that. I heard he moved to a different city, but part of me wonders if he's still out there, holding funerals for his spiders, or if he's found someone else who's willing to live in a house full of snakes and tarantulas. Either way, I'm glad I'm not part of that world anymore. This story still messes with my head. I honestly don't even know where to start, but looking back, I feel like I should have seen the signs way earlier. If anything, this taught me to trust my gut and not just give people a benefit of the doubt when things don't add up. I met Alex when I was in college. She seemed cool at first. One of those people who's got an infectious energy, always joking, always a good time when we hung out with mutual friends. I didn't think much of it at first, but we started talking more one-on-one, and eventually we started dating. We had been dating for a few months when things started to take a weird turn. At first, it wasn't anything major, just the usual relationship stuff. But then I noticed she started asking me for help with things that seemed off. It wasn't like the usual requests where you're just helping someone out because you care. She kept asking for money, which was odd because she always said how independent she was and how much she hated asking people for help. So when she asked for rent money for the place she was staying at, I thought it was just a one-time thing. After all, she'd never really asked for anything before, and I thought maybe she was just going through a rough patch. But then the requests kept coming. I remember feeling a little weird about it. The rent was for a house she was renting with roommates, but here's the thing, she wasn't asking for money for a place we both lived at. She was asking for money for a house that I had never even seen. She kept telling me how she was struggling to pay, and how it would help so much if I could help her out. I didn't feel comfortable with it. I mean, we were still figuring out our relationship, and it wasn't like we had joint bills or anything. So I told her I couldn't help out with that. I didn't feel responsible for paying for rent on a place I didn't even live in. That's when things started to get strange. At first, she was cool about it. She didn't push it too hard, but something felt off. The next time I saw her, she started talking about how it wasn't a big deal, how I was just being selfish, and how she really thought I'd be the one person who'd understand her situation. She was hurt, and I could tell, but I didn't think it was worth giving into. I had my own bills to pay, and I wasn't going to hand over a chunk of my savings to someone I wasn't even living with. The more I thought about it, the more it felt like she was trying to manipulate me into giving her money. A week or so later, I got a message from one of my friends. Apparently, Alex had been telling everyone that we were having problems because I refused to help her out when she really needed it. I brushed it off at first. People talk, and maybe she was just venting. But then things escalated quickly. I came home late one night after hanging out with some friends, and when I checked my phone, I had several messages from Alex. They were all pretty frantic, but one really stuck out to me. She accused me of assault. At first, I didn't believe it. I thought it was a joke. Maybe she was just drunk, or maybe she was mad about the money thing. But no, she wasn't joking. She told me on text that I had attacked her when she tried to ask for help with her rent. I was in shock. I couldn't even process what I was reading. She was trying to turn the whole situation around and make it seem like I was the bad guy. It made no sense to me at the time. She was the one who would ask for money that wasn't even my responsibility. She was the one who kept pushing after I said no, but she was accusing me of assault. It was like I was in some messed up nightmare. I tried calling her to talk things out, but she wouldn't pick up. Instead, I got another text saying she had already talked to some of her friends and family about what happened. She was making it sound like I had done something terrible, something I hadn't done. I was furious and hurt, but also completely confused. I couldn't figure out what she was trying to do, but I knew I had to be careful with how I handled it. I didn't want to make it worse by overreacting. The worst part, she started posting on Facebook. She made a whole post about how she was in a toxic relationship and how she'd been taken advantage of by someone she trusted. Her followers started commenting, and the whole thing spiraled out of control. People I didn't even know were tagging me in posts, calling me a monster, saying I didn't deserve to be with her. And all I could do was sit there, completely stunned by what was happening. I thought I had been dating a normal girl, someone who wasn't trying to manipulate or control me. But here she was trying to ruin my reputation, saying I had done something I hadn't. I felt like I was losing everything, like I was being dragged into a situation I couldn't escape from. I tried talking to her again, tried to explain how messed up it was that she was doing this, but she wouldn't listen. She said she had already made up her mind and that nothing I said would change what she was going through. She even said that if I didn't help her with rent, that I clearly didn't care about her, and she was done with me. But by that point, I didn't care anymore. She'd crossed a line. Eventually, things died down. The social media storm faded and people seemed to forget about it. But it didn't stop me from feeling completely betrayed. I couldn't believe she would go so far as to accuse me of something that serious just because I wouldn't give her money for a house I didn't live in. It was like she was using me to get what she wanted and didn't care who she hurt in the process. I've tried to move on from it, but every once in a while, I'll run into someone who mentions her, or I'll see her name pop up on social media. It's like a constant reminder of what happened, and I'll never forget how quickly everything went from being normal to completely out of control. It's a messed up feeling to know someone can twist reality like that, but I guess you learn the hard way who to trust. In the end, I'm just glad I got out of that situation before it went even further. Looking back, I realized how toxic it all was. It was one of the worst things I've ever been through, but I guess it taught me to be way more careful about who I let into my life. Trust is everything, and once it's broken, it's hard to rebuild. It's been years since it happened, but I still think about it every now and then. It was the kind of betrayal that stays with you, not just because of the act itself, but because of how it made me question everything: trust, friendships, and my own judgment. I've always had a small circle of friends, and I thought I knew who I could rely on. But life has a funny way of showing you that people aren't always what they seem. It started like any other normal relationship. Paul was this charming guy, funny and easy to talk to, with that kind of smile that made everyone feel at ease. We met at a mutual friend's birthday party, and at first I didn't think much of him. He seemed like just another guy at the party, but something about the way he made me laugh made me start paying attention. We started hanging out more, and I could tell he liked me. He'd ask me out, we'd go on dates, and everything felt like it was moving in the right direction. We were having fun, or at least I thought we were. At the time, my best friend Emily and I were super close. We'd been friends for years and went through everything together: high school drama, college stress, relationships. I always thought we had this unspoken understanding. When Paul came into the picture, she was excited for me. She was the one who encouraged me to go for it with him, saying how great he seemed and how he had that perfect vibe for me. Of course, I was happy she supported me, but part of me always felt like something was off with Paul. He was a little too smooth, too perfect, like maybe he was playing a role. But things went well for a while. We hang out, talk about our future, make plans, and I started falling for him. I trusted him. The worst part was that Emily had become really close to him too. She would come over, and the three of us would hang out. I thought it was a good thing, that she was getting along with him so well. Maybe I was even a little naive for thinking everything was just fine. Then, about 6 months into our relationship, things started to feel different. It wasn't like Paul was acting strange, but I noticed little things here and there. He'd be texting on his phone a lot more, even during the times we were supposed to be hanging out. He'd cancel plans last minute, and when I'd ask him why, he'd give me some vague excuse. The worst part was that I started noticing he was getting closer to Emily. I mean, closer in a way that wasn't just friends hanging out. They'd text each other constantly, make inside jokes, and meet up without me. I didn't think much of it at first, because they were friends too, right? But then, one night, I found something that I couldn't ignore. It was a random Tuesday, and I was at Emily's house. We were just chilling as usual. I was hanging out in her living room while she was in the kitchen, and as I got up to grab a drink, I noticed her phone was lying face up on the couch. I'm not proud of what I did next, but curiosity got the best of me. I picked it up just for a second to check the time, but I couldn't help myself. Her messages were on display. There were a lot of messages between Emily and Paul. Most of them seemed normal, but then I saw a few that made my stomach drop. It was one of those moments where your brain knows exactly what you're seeing, but it takes a minute to process. Paul had sent her texts saying things like, "I can't wait to see you tonight, and I wish I could just be with you." My heart started racing as I read more. The messages weren't just friendly, they were flirty. They were crossing a line. That's when I saw it. A photo. It wasn't an explicit photo, but it was enough to make everything make sense. It was Paul and Emily both smiling and clearly close, too close. It hit me all at once, and I could barely breathe. I couldn't tell if I was more angry or heartbroken, but I knew something was terribly wrong. I didn't even think twice before I put the phone back on the couch and walked out of the room. I had to process this, but I couldn't even talk to Emily about it. Not yet. I was so pissed I didn't even know what to do with myself. I kept telling myself that I was overreacting, that maybe I was reading too much into things. But deep down I knew. I knew something was happening between them. I had to confront it, but the thought of doing so made me sick. I waited for the right moment, which ended up being that same night when Paul came over to my apartment. He seemed normal, but I could tell something was off. He wasn't his usual self. He seemed distant, distracted. Maybe he was just tired. I don't even remember what exactly I said to him. I think I just asked if there was something going on between him and Emily. It wasn't even a direct accusation, just a question that I needed to ask. He looked at me, and for a second, I thought he was going to deny it. But then he didn't. He didn't deny it at all. He looked me straight in the eye and admitted it. He and Emily had been seeing each other behind my back for weeks. They'd been hooking up, and he didn't know how to tell me. He said it just happened. He wasn't sorry. There was no apology, no regret. He just didn't care. It was like he already checked out. I don't know what happened after that. I think I just stood there, trying to process the fact that the two people I trusted the most had been lying to me, using me. I felt like I was in a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. But no matter how much I wanted to deny it, there it was. The truth. I broke up with him, obviously. It wasn't even a question. I couldn't stay with someone who betrayed me like that. Someone who had no respect for me or my friendship with Emily. But the worst part wasn't just losing Paul. It was losing Emily. I couldn't look at her the same way again. It took me a long time to come to terms with how my best friend had slept with my boyfriend. I don't even know how I ever trusted her again. I still have trouble understanding why they did it. It wasn't just that they cheated on me. It was the fact that they both lied to my face for so long. I was always the one who had their backs, who listened to their problems, and in the end, it didn't mean anything. The betrayal wasn't just from Paul, it was from Emily too. And honestly, I don't think I'll ever forget how they both made me feel. It's one of those things that just stays with you. It was supposed to be a great night, honestly. The kind of birthday where you looked forward to dinner, a few laughs, maybe some drinks, and just enjoying time with someone special. But instead, it turned into one of the most awkward and stressful experiences in my life. I can't even look back at it without feeling that wave of anxiety all over again. It started when Destiny told me her birthday plans. She was super excited and kept talking about how she wanted it to be memorable, how she was planning to go out with a few of her close friends to this nice restaurant downtown. At first, it sounded great. She didn't have anything huge in mind, and I was happy to take her out and make sure she had a good time. So I thought, cool, I'll take her to a nice spot, and we'll just keep it low-key. I figured we'd have dinner, maybe dessert, and that'd be it. But I should have known something was off when she started texting me that morning. She kept saying things like, "Oh, I invited a couple more people, and my friends really want to come too." I didn't think too much of it at the time. I mean, she's social, right? She loves her friends, and it's her birthday, so what's a couple extra people at dinner? I didn't realize that this was just the beginning of the chaos. I'll admit I didn't ask too many questions. I was just excited to celebrate her birthday. So I showed up at the restaurant a little early to get the table set, and when I walked in, my stomach dropped. Destiny was there, sure, but there were already a few people sitting at the table. I thought it was just a couple of her closest friends, maybe 4 or 5 people tops. But when I walked in, there were at least 15 people gathered around, chatting and laughing like it was some kind of party. I froze for a second. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just a birthday dinner for 2. She hadn't told me she was inviting half her social circle. Now, I'm not the kind of guy who gets all freaked out by crowds, but this was much more than I expected. The place wasn't huge, so they were all crammed around a few tables, and I wasn't even sure where to sit. Destiny, on the other hand, was sitting there looking super happy, like everything was going exactly as planned. She waved me over, and I could tell she was proud of herself for pulling off the surprise. She introduced me to everyone, and I tried to act cool about it, like I wasn't just internally freaking out. The whole night was an awkward blur. Every time I thought I had a handle on the situation, more people kept showing up. By the time the appetizers came out, the table had turned into a full-blown group of strangers, and I was just one guy sitting there, wondering how in the world this was going to go down. It wasn't that I didn't want her to have fun, but this wasn't the birthday I had imagined. I figured I'd just go with the flow. What else could I do? Then the check came. I thought it was going to be a simple transaction. I figured I'd pay for Destiny's meal, maybe a couple of drinks for myself, and we'd call it a night. But no, everyone at the table seemed to expect me to foot the bill for the entire group. There was this sudden shift in energy when the check was placed in front of me. It felt like the entire table turned to watch me, almost in anticipation. I could feel every eye on me. I was honestly in shock. I mean, I didn't mind picking up the tab for a nice dinner for Destiny, but now I was being asked to pay for everyone. 15 people. 15 separate bills. I had no idea how to handle that. Destiny didn't help either. She just sat there, smiling like it was all part of the plan, acting like she had no clue how this had gotten so out of hand. She didn't even try to diffuse the situation, didn't suggest that we just pay for ourselves and call it a night. She just sat there like nothing was wrong. The waiter, who had clearly been trained to be polite, started laying out the suggested gratuity, which, by the way, was insane. I mean, it was already a nice dinner, but the total bill was climbing fast, way higher than I'd ever imagined. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I looked around at the group, all of them acting like it was just normal for me to pick up the check, like I had just volunteered for this role in the drama, and now it was time for me to pay my dues. My mind was racing. I didn't know what to do. I felt cornered, honestly. I had never been in a situation like this before. I wasn't some rich guy who could throw around cash like it was nothing. And I definitely wasn't prepared to take on an entire group's bill without any heads up. It was becoming painfully clear that Destiny hadn't even considered what this might cost me. She probably never thought about it at all. I pulled out my card, and as I did, I could feel the pressure building. There was no way I could back out now without looking like a jerk. The group had already started to chat again, pretending like everything was fine. But I couldn't shake this feeling of being taken advantage of. I was paying for a night that I didn't plan, for people I didn't know well, and for a celebration that was supposed to be about her, not some impromptu group dinner. I felt like a fool. The whole night felt like a trap I couldn't escape from. It was bad enough that I was being asked to cover the entire bill, but the way Destiny just sat there, so blissfully unaware of the situation she put me in, made it worse. It was like she had no regard for how this might affect me. It was her birthday, sure, but I never imagined it would cost me this much. When the check was finally paid, I felt like a weight had been lifted, but it was a strange, bitter relief. Destiny and her friends didn't even seem to notice how uncomfortable I was. It just kept laughing and talking as though everything was fine. It didn't see the toll it had taken on me, how embarrassed and stressed out I felt. The worst part, after everything, Destiny didn't even say thank you. She didn't seem to understand how much I had just sacrificed, how uncomfortable I had been, or how out of line her expectations were. And honestly, that moment stuck with me. It was the first time I realized maybe I wasn't being appreciated the way I should have been. That night left me questioning a lot about the relationship. I never told Destiny how I felt, and I don't think I ever could have. But deep down, I knew that the night had changed something. There was no going back from that. We ended things a few weeks later, and I walked away feeling like I'd just been part of a bad movie script. One where the main character gets used and manipulated without even realizing it. I'll never forget that birthday dinner and how it made me feel like I was just an afterthought in someone else's big plan. I thought I had the perfect guy. Nick was everything I thought I wanted at the time: charming, good-looking, funny. We met on a dating app, which is where I met most of the guys I dated, and he seemed cool. Like, not in the creepy way some guys can be, but the kind of guy you could bring home to your friends, who would make you laugh but also hold your hand like you were the only one in the room. Everything about him felt right, and honestly, I couldn't wait to spend more time with him. We started texting pretty much every day after we met, and our dates were always easygoing. A casual dinner here, a movie night there. Nothing too intense. But I guess that's where things went wrong. It was all so smooth and simple in the beginning that I didn't see the red flags. At first, it wasn't anything too weird. He'd remember small details from our conversations, like what my favorite snacks were or how I liked my coffee. And then he'd show up with it, or mention it randomly in a text, which was cute at first. But then the little things started to pile up, and before I knew it, they weren't so cute anymore. It started with him texting me a lot, like a lot. He'd text me in the morning, check in during the day, and then text me late at night. It wasn't the constant texting that bothered me, but more the fact that he seemed to always know when I was free. I'd be on my lunch break at work and get a message from him, asking how my day was. Or I'd post a selfie on Instagram, and within minutes, he'd text me saying how cute I looked. I shrugged it off at first, thinking I was just being paranoid. After all, I'd been the one who started this whole thing with him, so maybe I was just overthinking. But then things got weirder. I started noticing him pop up at places I frequented. It wasn't like he was sitting there waiting for me, but he'd show up at the same coffee shop I was at, or at the park. Once, I ran into him at the grocery store while I was picking up some snacks for movie night. I didn't think anything of it at first. Maybe it was just coincidence. People go to the same places, right? But after a few more incidents like that, I started feeling uncomfortable. There was something off about it. I didn't want to make a big deal out of nothing, but I couldn't help but feel like he was tracking me, like he knew where I'd be before I did. It wasn't just random anymore. It was starting to feel like he was planning it, showing up in places where I least expect it. The final straw came one night when I was at home scrolling through Instagram. I saw a message from Nick. It was just a simple text asking, "Hey, do you having a good night?" But something about it made me pause. I hadn't mentioned to him that I was at home, and I hadn't posted anything on social media yet. I looked out my window to see if he was outside. I know it sounds crazy, but I had this feeling in my gut. And there he was, standing by his car across the street, staring at my building. He wasn't even trying to hide it. He was just standing there, looking up at my window like he was waiting for me to notice him. That's when it all clicked. He wasn't just texting me constantly or popping up at random places. He was tracking me. I don't know how, but he was. I felt it was suffocating. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to confront him, ask him why he was doing this, but I was scared. Scared of what would happen if I pushed him too far. Scared of what he might do next. So I stopped responding to his messages. I blocked him on social media. I didn't want him to have any way of getting in touch with me. But blocking him didn't help. A few days later, I got a text from an unknown number. It was him. He was using a different phone now, and that's when I realized how serious this had gotten. The texts were creepy. He started saying things like, "I just want to be close to you," and "I know you're still thinking about me." And it wasn't just the texts. I started seeing him at random places again. This time, he'd be standing outside my apartment building at night or parked a few blocks away, just sitting there in his car, staring at the building. He'd even text me while he was there, telling me how beautiful my place looked from the outside. I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't get him to leave me alone. Every time I thought he'd finally gotten the message, he'd pop back up, creeping through my life like a shadow I couldn't escape. I tried talking to a few of my friends about it, but no one took me seriously. They thought I was overreacting. Maybe they just didn't understand how creepy it was to have someone stalking you like that. And that's when I realized I was on my own with this. He had me trapped. Finally, after weeks of this, I decided to call the police. They told me to get a restraining order. But even that didn't stop him. I'm pretty sure he just found ways to get around it, using different numbers or accounts to contact me. I started feeling like there was nowhere I could hide, nowhere I could go where he wouldn't find me. I had to leave the city eventually. I moved to a completely different area, changed my phone number, and wiped my social media accounts. But even now, I still worry. Sometimes when I'm walking down the street or scrolling through my phone, I'll get this sickening feeling like he's watching me. And honestly, I'll probably always feel that way. The worst part about being stalked isn't the person themselves. It's the fear that they're always out there somewhere, waiting for the next chance to creep into your life again. And no matter how far you run, you can't outrun the feeling that they're right behind you. I'd never thought something like this could happen to me. I mean, I always heard about weird things happening to other people, but I never imagined I'd be the one caught in some messed up situation. Looking back now, I still can't believe it. I dated a girl named Jenny for a while, and she was different. In a way, I thought she was quirky at first. She had this mysterious aura about her, the kind of vibe you'd expect from someone who didn't fit in with the norm. But to be honest, I didn't think much of it. Maybe I should have. It all started out innocent enough. We met through some mutual friends, and she was pretty chill. At first, I thought she was just artsy and a little eccentric, but we hit it off. Jenny had this vibe that made her seem like she was always thinking a few steps ahead, like she knew something you didn't, and honestly, it was a little exciting. Who doesn't want to date someone with that kind of energy, right? She was cool, mysterious, and on the surface seemed pretty normal. But it didn't take long before I started noticing little things. First, it was small stuff, like how she would always ask about my hair. At first, I thought she was just being affectionate or maybe a little obsessive, but I let it slide. Then, after we'd spend time together, she would always ask if she could keep some of my hair. I thought it was weird, but in an offbeat, oh, she's probably just being cute kind of way. She'd joke about making a scrapbook or a memory box with little mementos of our time together. I laughed it off because, well, who doesn't do that, right? It started to get more frequent. At first, it was just a few strands of hair that she'd snip off while I was sleeping or when I wasn't paying attention. I didn't think much of it at the time again. I just figured it was one of her quirks. But then it started getting weird. She started talking more about the energy she felt from things, how my hair held some kind of power, and how she could sense things through it. I thought she was just messing around, so I laughed it off. But the more she said, the more uncomfortable I started to feel. Then one night things took a turn. I was over at her place and I noticed a bunch of candles lit around the room. Not the romantic kind you might expect for a cozy date night, but more like the kind you'd see in a ritual or something. There were weird symbols drawn on the walls in what looked like chalk, and a few of her books were filled with stuff that looked like ancient scripts or spells. It honestly freaked me out. I asked her what the deal was with all the candles and weird books, and she just gave me this smile like I was being paranoid. She told me it was just a hobby, something she did for spiritual clarity. But the vibe in that room was so off. I didn't know what was going on, but something felt wrong. She acted like it was no big deal, so I tried to brush it off. I told myself maybe I was just overthinking it. When I went to leave, I caught her quietly pulling strands of my hair from my jacket. I had no idea how long she had been doing this, but that was when I realized something was seriously wrong. The next few weeks were a blur. Jenny's behavior became more and more bizarre. I started noticing she was acting distant, and yet there was something about her that felt almost possessive. It's hard to explain, but she started doing things that made me feel like I didn't have any privacy anymore. She'd follow me around, and when I asked what was going on, she'd just get this strange look on her face. It was like she wasn't really hearing me. It was as though she was looking past me, like I wasn't even there sometimes. One day, I was cleaning up in my apartment when I found a few strands of hair stuck to a sticky note on my desk. The note said something like, "For our connection." That's when it hit me. The hair wasn't just some silly thing she was doing for fun. She was keeping it for a reason, and that reason was starting to feel dark. I started going through my stuff, and I found more hair. Under my pillow, in my drawers, hidden in corners. It was like she was collecting it, and that's when I began to realize what was happening. She wasn't just saving it for sentimental reasons. She was doing something with it. I confronted her about it. I tried to stay calm, but I could feel my anxiety rising as I spoke. She told me she was just holding on to our connection, and that the hair helped her stay in tune with me. But the more she said, the more it sounded like she was talking about something else entirely. I told her to stop, but she just brushed it off like it was no big deal. At that point, I was scared. I couldn't figure out what kind of game she was playing, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. Then one night, I came home from work and found her in my apartment. She wasn't supposed to be there. She let herself in somehow, and she had a small box in her hands. I didn't know what was in it, but I saw that it was filled with more of my hair. Pieces of it, like she had been snipping it off for weeks. I didn't know what she was planning to do with it, but I had a sinking feeling in my stomach that something really bad was about to happen. She wouldn't let me leave, though. She said it was almost ready, like she was preparing something. She had this intense look in her eyes, and that's when I realized she had been doing black magic on me. I didn't know how to react, but I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I grabbed my things, called a cab, and left. I didn't go back. The whole thing felt insane, like some dark, twisted nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. Jenny was never a normal person, but I never imagined she'd go this far. I don't know exactly what she was planning with all that hair. I don't know what kind of rituals or spells she was trying to perform, but I'm pretty sure I don't want to know. The worst part is that I think she's still out there somewhere, trying to finish whatever it is she started. I don't even know if I'm safe. Maybe it sounds paranoid, but I still check under my pillow and through my things just in case. You never know what someone like that could do. It was supposed to be a normal dinner. You know, the kind where you meet your boyfriend's parents for the first time, and you're nervous but excited to make a good impression. It's supposed to be casual, nothing too serious, just getting to know the people who raised the person you're dating. Solomon, my boyfriend at the time, had been talking about his family for weeks. How loving they were, how much they cared about him, how close they were. I had heard about his mom and dad, and honestly, I was looking forward to meeting them. I thought I was ready. I couldn't have been more wrong. I remember it like it was yesterday. It was a Saturday evening, and Solomon picked me up from my place. He was acting a little off, but I chalked it up to nerves. We didn't talk about anything serious on the drive over. It wasn't until we got to his parents' house that I started to feel that little knot in my stomach. His house was big, nothing fancy, but it was very well kept, like they took pride in their appearance. The whole place was clean, orderly, and smelled like incense. I thought it was a bit much, but whatever. I'm not picky. He opened the door for me and I walked inside, smiling politely. His mom, who I heard so much about, was the first to greet me. She was tall, with sharp features and dark eyes that seemed to be constantly scrutinizing everything. His dad wasn't home yet, but his mom was more than enough to make me feel uncomfortable. She was polite at first, giving me that warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. We sat down in the living room, and she immediately started asking questions about my background, my family, what I did for a living. I'm an artist. I have an art degree that I worked hard for, and I was proud of it. I didn't expect people to always understand what I did, but I thought Solomon's family might be different. After all, he was an artist too. We'd bonded over that. So when I mentioned my degree, expecting it to be a casual part of the conversation, I wasn't prepared for her reaction. She went silent for a moment, her eyes narrowing in a way that made me feel like I was being examined under a microscope. Then she asked me, "So, you went to school for art?" There was a sort of judgment in her tone that I couldn't place at first. I nodded, thinking maybe I had misunderstood her. But then she leaned forward, her expression growing even colder. "That's interesting," she said slowly, like she was trying to piece together a puzzle in her head. I wasn't sure what was happening, but it didn't feel right. I tried to steer the conversation elsewhere, but she wasn't having it. She kept asking about my degree, as if it was something that needed to be explained, like I had just told her I was a circus performer or something equally bizarre. And then the bomb dropped. Solomon's dad walked in, and he was immediately part of the interrogation. The two of them started questioning me about my art degree, and not in the curious way you'd expect when people ask about something they don't understand. No, this felt like an attack. His mom's questions were sharp and pointed, but his dad's were even worse. He asked me how I plan on making a living with my degree. He asked me if I even understood the real world, and how unrealistic my career choice was. It was like I was being judged for the choices I made in life, and all because I'd chosen something as innocent as pursuing art. I tried to explain that I was working hard to build my career, that I loved what I did, and that it was my passion, but they weren't having it. They told me that I would never get anywhere with an art degree, that it was a waste of time, and that I'd end up struggling for the rest of my life. I was completely blindsided by their hostility, and no matter how hard I tried to defend myself, they just shot me down. I didn't even know how to respond anymore. The worst part, Solomon was just sitting there silent. He didn't say a word in my defense. He didn't try to calm his parents down or back me up. It felt like he was just letting me be torn apart. It felt like hours before dinner was actually served. By then, I had completely lost my appetite. The whole atmosphere was so tense that I couldn't focus on anything but how uncomfortable I was. I didn't even want to eat, but they kept pushing me to try everything, telling me how lucky I was to be in their presence and how fortunate I should feel. The food was fine, but I barely tasted it. I just kept thinking, is this really happening? Are these people actually saying this to me? And it got worse. When I tried to shift the topic to something else, his mom would snap right back to the art degree issue. She kept making little jabs about how I was probably just wasting my time and that I should reconsider my career choices before I ended up regretting them. Her tone was so dismissive that it made me feel like I didn't even matter. By the time dinner was over, I was mentally drained, and I could feel the anxiety building in my chest. But the worst part of it all wasn't even the berating. It was Solomon's complete lack of support. Not once did he defend me. Not once did he say, "Hey, that's not okay." He didn't stick up for me at all. I felt so alone in that moment, like I was just some outsider, some stranger who didn't belong there. It was like everything I had ever done in my life, the work I'd put into my art, my passion, meant absolutely nothing to these people. I left that dinner feeling more broken than I had in a long time. Solomon didn't say much as we drove home, just a few awkward words about how his parents could be intense sometimes. It wasn't just his parents. It was the fact that Solomon had stood by and let it happen. If he couldn't stand up for me then, what did that say about how he felt about me? That night, I went home and thought long and hard. I realized that I couldn't be with someone who didn't support me, who didn't care enough to defend me when I needed it the most. I broke up with Solomon a few days later. It was the hardest decision I ever made, but it was the right one. I knew I deserved someone who would lift me up, not tear me down. I'll never forget that night. The way they looked at me like I was beneath them, the way Solomon just sat there and let it happen. It showed me that sometimes the people you think you know the best can surprise you in the worst possible ways. I'd never thought a simple thing like answering my phone at work would cause everything to unravel. It started off small. Winnie, my girlfriend, calling me while I was at work. At first, I thought it was sweet. She just wanted to talk, and I'd answer quickly, tell her I was busy, and go back to whatever I was doing. But it became more frequent. She'd call me every couple of hours, then it was once an hour, and soon it was multiple times a day. It didn't seem like much at first, but over time it started to get to me. It wasn't the calls themselves, it was the timing. I worked at a busy cafe with long shifts, and whenever she called, I had to drop what I was doing, answer the phone, and rush the conversation along before the next customer came in. It was starting to feel like I couldn't catch a break. Winnie wasn't a bad person by any means. In the beginning, she was fun, caring, and everything I thought I wanted. But the more I tried to explain how overwhelmed I was at work, the more she seemed to ignore me. It wasn't just the phone calls anymore. It started to feel like she couldn't go a day without checking in, without needing to know where I was or who I was with. One day I decided to address it. I didn't want to hurt her feelings, but I couldn't keep going on like this. I figured it was better to just be honest. So I told her that maybe she should call less often while I was at work. I didn't want to sound rude, but I needed some space to focus. After all, I was at work to, work. That's when things went sideways. She didn't take it well at all. At first, she went quiet, like she was processing what I had said. Then, all of a sudden, her tone shifted. She got defensive, and the conversation quickly escalated. I didn't know what to expect, but certainly not this. The next day, I was in the middle of a busy shift when I got a call from my manager. He said there was a woman at the front asking for me. My stomach dropped. I didn't even need to ask who it was. I could already guess. It was Winnie. I immediately went to the front, and sure enough, there she was, standing there, arms crossed, a look of frustration on her face. She didn't even acknowledge the employees or customers around her. It was like the world just didn't matter in that moment. It was just her and me. I walked up to her, trying to keep my cool, but I could feel the tension in my chest. I tried to ask her what she was doing here, but before I could even finish my sentence, she exploded. She started accusing me of cheating, of lying to her, of being distant. She said I was ignoring her and giving my attention to other people. She told me that I must have been seeing someone else if I didn't want to talk to her all the time. It was like a bomb had gone off, and I was left standing there, trying to figure out how to piece it all back together. I was stunned. I tried to explain that it wasn't about that. It wasn't about not wanting to talk to her. It was just that I needed to focus on work when I was at work. I didn't even have time to think about anything else. But she wouldn't listen. Her accusations grew louder, and soon people were starting to stare. I tried to calm her down, but it was like talking to a wall. The more I tried to reason with her, the more she spiraled. She was convinced that I had been lying, that I was hiding something from her. I had never seen her like this before. Winnie had always been sweet, funny, and understanding. But this was something else. She didn't care that I was at work, that I had customers waiting. She didn't care about anything but her version of the story. She was standing there making a scene, calling me names, accusing me of things I hadn't even done. The worst part, my coworkers and customers were watching all of it unfold. Some of them looked uncomfortable. Others just stared in silence. I could feel my face getting hot, my hands starting to shake. I wanted to make it stop, but I didn't know how. I didn't know what to do to make it all go away. Eventually, my manager stepped in. He tried to ask Winnie to leave, but she didn't listen. She wasn't leaving until I admitted to something I didn't even do. I was getting more and more embarrassed, frustrated, and honestly a little scared. I couldn't understand why she was acting this way. It felt like a completely different person was standing in front of me. After what felt like hours, my manager finally got her to leave the cafe. He told me to take a break, but I just couldn't. I didn't want to go back to the table, the customers, the place where everything had just been shattered. I went to the back and sat in the staff room, my head spinning. I didn't even know how to process everything that had just happened. When I finally left work that night, Winnie texted me. She was apologizing, saying that she didn't mean what she had said, that she was just emotional. But something in the back of my mind told me that this wasn't going to go away. I couldn't shake the feeling that her behavior was escalating, that this was just the beginning of something far worse. I tried to give her a chance to explain herself, but the more we talked, the more I realized something wasn't right. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. There was something deeper going on with her, something that made her feel like she couldn't trust me, like she had to control every part of my life. It wasn't just the phone calls or the accusations. It was the possessiveness, the lack of boundaries. I had tried to reason with her, but I was losing myself in the process. I eventually ended the relationship. It wasn't easy, but I knew I couldn't keep going down that road. The drama, the constant need for reassurance, the lack of trust, it was all too much. I realized that sometimes when you meet someone new, you can't always see the red flags until it's too late. The weird thing is, she never really understood why I ended things. Even now, I sometimes get messages from her apologizing, asking if we can talk. But I've learned to ignore them. Some things are better left in the past, and some people can't be changed, no matter how hard you try. It wasn't just about a phone call at work. It was about control. And I'm glad I got out before it got worse. I still remember the day I met Luke like it was yesterday. It was at a party, one of those college get-togethers where everyone is just trying to have fun, letting loose after a long week of classes and work. I wasn't expecting much, but Luke, with his easy smile and the way he made everyone laugh, caught my eye right away. He seemed so confident, the kind of guy who could walk into a room and instantly make you feel comfortable. We hit it off pretty quickly. He was funny kind, and just seemed like the perfect guy. But the deeper I got into that relationship, the more I started to see the cracks. At first, there were small, subtle things that I brushed off, thinking I was overreacting. But eventually, those cracks widened, and I realized I had gotten myself into something way darker than I ever expected. At first, everything was great. We went on dates, watched movies, laughed, and had deep conversations about everything under the sun. Luke made me feel special. He'd always tell me how lucky he was to have found me, how he couldn't believe I'd even given the time of day. It felt good to hear that, to feel like I was the one he'd been waiting for. But over time, the compliments started to feel like pressure. The more he complimented me, the more it felt like he needed something from me, like he was trying to convince me to stay in this perfect little bubble he had built around us. And then came the jealousy. It started small too, like when I'd hang out with friends or talk to a guy in class. At first, I didn't think much of it. I mean, who doesn't get a little jealous sometimes? But when he started to get upset over the smallest things, like a comment from one of my guy friends, that's when I started to feel uneasy. I couldn't wear certain clothes without him making a comment about it. He didn't like me going out alone or talking to other people. At first, I thought he just cared a lot, that maybe he was just protective. But it didn't take long for that protection to feel more like control. The first time I really felt something was off was when he yelled at me for being late. I'd been out with some friends and I lost track of time. It wasn't like I had disappeared or done anything wrong. I was just having a good time. But when I walked into the apartment, I saw a look on his face. I could tell something was wrong. He didn't even greet me. He just started going off about how I was disrespecting him, how I couldn't even respect his time. It didn't make sense, but in that moment, I tried to justify it in my head. I told myself that maybe I had messed up, that I should have been more considerate. The yelling didn't stop there, though. As time went on, the arguments started to happen more often. Sometimes it was about the smallest things. I'd forget to do a chore, and it would turn into a huge fight. He'd say things like, "You don't care about me," or "You never listen." I would try to explain, but it never felt like enough. He always had a way of twisting my words, making me feel like I was the one in the wrong, even when I wasn't. It wasn't just the words, though. It was the way he looked at me when he was angry, like I wasn't even a person anymore. He'd get so close to my face, and I could feel his breath, the heat of his anger seeping into my skin. There were times when I wanted to leave, to just walk away from it all, but every time I thought about it, the fear crept in. I was scared of what he might do, of what he might say. He would apologize after each fight, but it never felt sincere. He promised to change, but then it would happen all over again. The emotional abuse started to feel like a constant weight on my chest. He'd tell me that no one else would ever love me like he did, that I'd never find anyone who understood me the way he did. He made me doubt myself, question my worth. The little things that used to make me happy, talking to my friends, going for a walk outside, or just having a laugh, slowly started to fade away. I felt trapped, like there was no way out, but I kept telling myself I was being dramatic, that it was just a rough patch, and it would get better. One night, things took a turn. We were at his place, and he had been acting distant all evening. I didn't know why. I hadn't done anything wrong, but there was this tension hanging in the air like something was about to break. I asked him what was going on, and that's when he snapped. He started yelling at me, calling me selfish and accusing me of being ungrateful. I tried to explain, but my words seemed to make him angrier. I wanted to leave, but he grabbed my arm. It wasn't hard enough to bruise, but it was enough to make me freeze. I could see the anger in his eyes, and for the first time I wasn't sure if I was safe. That night I stayed. I didn't know what else to do. I told myself it would blow over. He apologized, like he always did, but it didn't make things okay. The worst part was that I didn't tell anyone. I didn't tell my friends, my family, anyone. I was so embarrassed. I didn't want to believe it was happening. I didn't want anyone to think I was weak. But deep down, I knew something had changed. I started avoiding him, making excuses to leave early, lying about plans so I wouldn't have to face him. But he'd always find a way to trap me, to make me feel like I was the one who was in the wrong. Slowly, the walls of my world started closing in, and I realized how far gone I was. He'd become my whole world, and in doing so, he made me forget who I was. The day I left, I remember feeling like I was walking on a fog. I packed my things when he was out, not knowing where I'd go, but knowing that I couldn't stay there anymore. I had to leave for my own sanity, and when I finally walked away, it felt like the hardest thing I had ever done. It wasn't an easy journey after that. There were moments where I still missed him, moments where I second-guessed myself, but I learned to rebuild. It wasn't just about getting out of that relationship. It was about rediscovering who I was before I let him tear me down. I'll never forget what I went through, but I've learned that walking away was the best decision I could have made. And I'll never let anyone make me feel small again. It's funny how things can seem perfect at first, like when you meet someone and everything just clicks. That's what it felt like when I first started dating Kimmy. She was fun, outgoing, and we just seemed to get each other. But then slowly things started to unravel. I had no idea that the relationship I thought was going somewhere would turn into a nightmare. Kimmy and I had been dating for a few months when I invited her to meet my mom. I wasn't one of those guys who was super close with his mom, but she was still important to me, and I figured it would be a good way to show Kimmy that I wanted things to move forward. You know, the whole meeting the parents thing, right? I could tell something was off when Kimmy walked into my house that day. It wasn't like she was nervous or excited, like how most people are when they meet someone's family for the first time. No, she just seemed annoyed, like she couldn't care less. My mom greeted her warmly, of course, but Kimmy barely responded. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe she was just having an off day. But the more time went on, the more I saw how much Kimmy actually hated my mom. It started small. Kimmy would make little sarcastic comments about my mom's cooking or how she was always hovering around. She'd roll her eyes if my mom asked too many questions about her day or if she showed concern over something Kimmy mentioned. I shrugged it off at first. I mean, not everyone gets along with their partner's family, right? But as time went on, it got worse. My mom, being the kind of person she is, would try to include Kimmy in conversations, but Kimmy would shut her down every time. I noticed that my mom was starting to get quieter around her, and that made me uncomfortable, but I didn't want to rock the boat too much, so I just tried to keep the peace. Then came the one night that completely flipped everything upside down. It started with dinner. We were all sitting at the table, and I could feel the tension in the air. Kimmy wasn't saying much, but I could tell she was fuming. My mom was talking about some new book she'd read, and out of nowhere, Kimmy snapped. She said something about how my mom was always acting like she knows everything, how she was trying to be a know-it-all, and how it was honestly annoying. I was caught off guard. My mom was taken aback too, but she didn't say anything. She just looked at me with a hurt expression. I tried to change the subject, but Kimmy wouldn't let it go. She kept going, making more biting remarks about how out of touch my mom was, and how I should be with someone who wasn't so clingy and overbearing. I didn't know what to do. My mom was sitting there looking like she was going to cry, and I just felt completely stuck. Kimmy was the one I was supposed to be with, but she hated my mom, and it felt like my whole world was falling apart right there at the dinner table. From that moment on, it got worse. Every time I went to visit my mom, Kimmy would make some excuse not to come, saying she had other plans or wasn't feeling up to it. I didn't know what to make of it. I tried talking to her about it, but she would just get defensive. She'd say things like, "I just don't like your mom," or "she's too much for me." I couldn't understand it. I mean, I didn't expect them to be best friends, but I didn't think it was too much to ask for her to be polite, at least. The real kicker was when we were planning a weekend trip to go visit my mom at her cabin in the mountains. Kimmy flat out refused to go. She told me it was stupid and that she didn't want to spend a weekend with someone who was always trying to make her feel uncomfortable. I told her that if she wasn't coming, I wouldn't go either, but she didn't care. She was more than happy to stay behind, and I could feel the pressure building. I ended up going alone. My mom was, of course, disappointed that Kimmy wasn't there, but she never said anything about it. It wasn't until the second day of the trip that things really hit the fan. My mom and I were sitting on the porch, just talking and enjoying the view, when she asked me if Kimmy was really the one I wanted to be with. She said it casually, but I could tell she was concerned. And that's when I started to realize that maybe I wasn't seeing things clearly. My mom's question stuck with me the entire weekend, and when I got back to the city, I started paying more attention to how Kimmy treated me when we were alone. She'd make snide remarks about my mom, criticize the way she did things, and even talk about how she thought my mom was too old-fashioned and clingy. It was like she was trying to drive a wedge between us, and I didn't know what to do about it. At that point, I was really torn. Kimmy was the girl I had been seeing for months. She was smart, funny, and had this wild, magnetic energy that I loved being around. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that something was off. It wasn't just that she didn't get along with my mom. It was how much she hated her, how much she seemed to want to tear us apart. I eventually had to make a decision. It wasn't easy. Kimmy and I broke up after a long talk, but it wasn't a clean break. She accused me of siding with my mom, and even went as far as to say that I was choosing her over me. The whole situation was messy, and I felt awful. But deep down, I knew it was the right choice. I had to pick my family over a relationship that was slowly suffocating me. Looking back now, I can see the red flags I ignored, and I can't help but feel relieved that I walked away when I did. Kimmy's hatred for my mom wasn't just a minor issue. It was a symptom of something deeper, something unhealthy. It didn't matter how perfect the relationship seemed at the beginning. It wasn't worth losing myself over, and honestly, after everything, I've never been so grateful for my mom's love and support. I didn't expect this to happen. I was just dating Jimmy, a guy I thought was chill and really down to earth. But what I discovered behind closed doors completely changed everything. And honestly, I don't think I'll ever look at relationships the same way again. It all started when we'd been dating for a few months. Jimmy and I met through a mutual friend, and at first, it seemed like we just clicked. He was fun to hang out with, super easygoing, and seemed like he was genuinely into me. I was still in that stage of the relationship where everything felt perfect, and we do cute stuff like go to the park, get coffee, or binge watch shows on the weekends. No big deal. It was the kind of casual, low-maintenance relationship I thought I needed. I trusted him. But that all started to unravel when I noticed he was getting a bit distant. Not like the usual work's been tough kind of distant. More like he was checked out, but he wouldn't say why. He started canceling plans or leaving early when we hung out. At first, I thought he was just busy with life, or maybe he was going through something that he didn't want to talk about. But as time passed, something kept nagging me. Then one night, things got weird. Jimmy had stayed over at my place, and we were about to head out for dinner. He was on his phone, and I glanced over his shoulder just to check the time. But what I saw on his screen made my stomach drop. There were texts from someone named Mistress Veronica. The messages were cryptic, alluding to things like training and obedience, and I froze. At first, I thought maybe it was some weird joke or an inside thing, but something in my gut told me this wasn't normal. He always kept his phone face down, and I had never seen him act like this before. He looked up at me, but I quickly turned away. I didn't say anything, but I was definitely shook. I decided I would wait and see if it happened again before I jumped to conclusions. Over the next few days, Jimmy's behavior got stranger. I found myself keeping tabs on him more than usual, not because I didn't trust him, but because something felt wrong. Every time I'd ask him about his day or what he'd been up to, his answers felt off, vague, rushed, like he was trying to hide something. But I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, so I kept it to myself. I didn't want to seem controlling or insecure. But then the texts kept coming. Mistress Veronica was always on the other end of them, and the tone was always the same, cryptic and loaded with dominance. At first, they were just texts, but I began to notice things like "good boy" and "you've been a very obedient pet today." The worst part, the way Jimmy started acting more and more uncomfortable whenever I was around. He'd lock his phone or quickly hide it, but I had seen enough to know what was going on. Finally, one night, I confronted him. I asked about the messages. He tried to laugh it off, but I wasn't buying it anymore. I wasn't some paranoid girlfriend. I was starting to piece things together. He wasn't just talking to some random person. The way he avoided the subject told me everything I needed to know. He'd been seeing this person, and not in a normal way. I was afraid to even ask questions at first, but the more I pushed, the more he cracked. Jimmy finally admitted it. He told me that Mistress Veronica wasn't just a friend. She was a dominatrix he'd been seeing behind my back, and she wasn't just some one-time thing. No, this had been going on for months. He explained that he'd been going to her for sessions, but he insisted it was all consensual and part of his lifestyle. I sat there numb as he explained how he enjoyed being controlled in ways that were completely out of my comfort zone. He talked about the training he had been undergoing, how he liked to be dominated, how it was something he needed in his life. I couldn't believe it. I didn't even know how to respond. On one hand, I was furious. On the other hand, I was confused. How had he been able to hide this from me for so long? It felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Jimmy had been leading a double life, and I had no idea. What hit me hardest was how much he seemed to downplay it, like it wasn't a big deal. He kept trying to assure me it wasn't anything personal, that he still cared about me, but that this was just something he needed to do. I wanted to scream at him, ask him how he could keep something like that from me, but the words wouldn't come out. I was too shocked, too hurt. The worst part, he wasn't even sorry. He kept talking about how it wasn't cheating, how it was just a lifestyle choice, and how it had nothing to do with me or our relationship. I knew deep down it wasn't about me, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. For a while, I didn't know what to do. I tried to ignore the reality of it, just go on like everything was fine. But I couldn't. Every time I looked at him, I saw the person he'd been behind my back. I saw the secrets, the lies, the manipulation. I couldn't trust him anymore. And worst of all, I couldn't ignore that I had been played for a fool. We didn't last long after that. Jimmy was insistent on keeping his lifestyle, and I was insistent on not being part of it. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that no matter how much I cared about him, I could never accept the kind of relationship he was offering. It wasn't just about him being into something that made me uncomfortable. It was about how he'd hidden it from me, how he'd lied and manipulated me into thinking everything was normal. Eventually, I ended things. It wasn't a clean break, and it definitely wasn't easy. I still think about it sometimes, wondering how I could have been so blind. But one thing is for sure, I'm never going to let someone get that close to me again without knowing who they really are.